one more time, thank you for your patience. And as Professor Levin would say, this is another test of improbability, so we're going to try to start our forum now. And it's my pleasure to introduce Richard Levins. He's an organizer, farmer, thinker, and epidemiologist. He was a pioneer member of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, and he's also a John Rock Professor of Population Science at the Harvard School of Public Health. He resigned his elected membership at the National Academy of Science to protest his relationship with the military. Above all else, Richard Levins' continuing contribution of humanity as a whole of his work on dialectics as a way to think through and act as a society's challenges is one more time here. This event is co-organized with our friends at the Berg Forum in New York City. Richard's presentation includes their introduction to Marxism intensive session entitled All That Is Solid Melts into Earth. Of course, after that difficult line from the manifesto. For 35 years, challenging retreats, recession, and repression, the Berg Forum has been an almost singular voice in New York and even nationally as a space for both ideas and actions. Encuentro Cívico also finds it a role model in the Berg Forum. So with no more, I would like to introduce Dr. Richard Levins.
Thanks. It's really interesting that there's an interest now in the United States in questions of science, relations with nature, history, even human evolution. The question is, why should people who are primarily concerned with stopping the juggernaut of the military, with preventing the deterioration of our environment, be concerned with long-term issues of science and philosophy? There are two kinds of answers I can give. First, the historical one, which is that the socialist movement has traditionally considered science and history as part of its domain. Their understanding was that the wonderful knowledge and literature and understanding that we as a species share was produced out of the surplus labor of farmers, peasants, working people, so we have a right to it. And my grandfather, who had about a third or fourth grade education, insisted that as a minimum every socialist worker should know history, cosmology, and evolution. The evolution that he taught me was a bit out of date, but that didn't matter. The important thing was that these were things that we were discussing. This tradition extended to the cigar makers of the Caribbean, where Puerto Rican and Cuban cigar makers would hire a reader in the workshops to read from world literature in the mornings and science and history in the afternoons. The Cooper Union in New York, the Garrick Theater in Chicago, the Little Blue Books publishing house in Girard, Kansas, were all attempts to share the learning of the world with people who are normally deprived from access to that learning. So in one sense, the struggle for scientific and historical and cultural knowledge is part of a struggle for liberation. A second kind of explanation is that we need it. That those of us who are concerned with changing the world should really know what we're doing. Otherwise, we repeat the efforts, we rediscover the Mediterranean regularly, and this leads us into the classical kinds of mistakes that are made. Now, I'm going to include mistakes that are made in science and also in politics, because I don't think that science and politics are really all that separate. They have common intellectual structures. They have common difficulties. Science is always committing error, and the defense of science against fundamentalism is not that we're perfect and they're idiots. It's that we get an improved understanding each time our relations with nature and each other becomes deeper. It was the steam engine that gave us thermodynamics. It was lens grinding for eyeglasses that gave us the microscope and microbiology and so on. So much of our knowledge comes from acting in the world. So there's a dual nature to science. On the one hand, it represents the long-term historical deepening of our understanding of the world as a species. But the other part of it is that science always belongs to somebody. Knowledge is owned. And the question of who owns the science will determine who's allowed to participate in it, who shares its products, who is enabled to understand the science, who's allowed to do experiments, who publishes the results, and who has access to reading it. So the struggle then for an understanding of science is not simply a passive absorption, a saying that we have a right to knowledge, but also a right to criticize that knowledge and to look at the mistakes that science is always making. I'll just toss out a few of these. When I was in grade school, we were told that the noble gases, helium, neon, radon, and so on, xenon, could not form chemical compounds. Now we know that in combination with something as active as fluorine, they certainly do. When I was a kid, we studied geography on the assumption that the continents had fixed locations. It was only when I was in graduate school that there was a little bit of snickering about so-and-so says that the continents move around. And then the question came up, well, why is it that there are alligators in the world only in eastern China and in Florida, in eastern North America? And people would invent explanations for this. Well, so science is constantly making assumptions, and some of these assumptions are harmful. We kill about 60,000 or 100,000 patients a year in our hospitals out of well thought out applications of scientific knowledge. Pesticides increase pests. Antibiotics increase diseases. Hospitals are the focus of infection. Climate has changed over world geological time, but even over the time span when our own very young species has still been alive. So why does science make mistakes? And I'm claiming that the major reason for the big mistakes in science comes from its location in society. Science is owned. The owners of science decide who's allowed to study science, what is considered legitimate science, what is a good problem to work on for a dissertation, what is considered a legitimate and interesting solution to a problem, what is going to happen to the product of that research. And because there are economic stakes in science and the products of science, the owners of science determine not only what is studied, but also what is excluded from study. The things that are dismissed as quackish, not proven, idiosyncratic. We have a whole series of terms for rejecting propositions that we don't like. So the attempt to develop a science which is really going to help people in their struggle for liberation involves not only demanding access to science, but also criticizing that science. And in the developing countries particularly, the question is, science has had many world centers in the past. In China, India, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Central America. At the present time, it's dominated by Euro-North America. Most of the publishing is in English. A lot of the best fellowships are available in Europe and in the United States, so that the ambition for third world students is very often to get a degree from Oxford. But once that happens, they learn not only the technology of molecular biology, but also the reason for it. And they're taught the thing to do is to zero in on the particular molecule that's responsible for this, or the particular microorganism. What is the cause of? And when you get a plant which has had medicinal properties in the world for hundreds of years. What the corporations do is ask, what is the active ingredient? So they don't consider what the evolution of plants has been. Plants produce a large number of exotic compounds as defenses against bugs and defenses against infection. And what they do is produce a whole array of these things. Molecules that are related to each other, similar, and jointly can produce a defense, or in medicine, a cure, rather than extracting the one molecule which can be patented and sold. So therefore, the struggle for a liberating science has to deal with the subject matter of the science, as well as the economics, the questions of access, and so forth. Modern Western science is a product of the capitalist revolution, essentially the 17th century, of Locke and Hume and Bacon and Newton and all of those fellows. And for them, the understanding of the world was analogous to the understanding of the marketplace. There are atoms of economic activity, namely the self-serving individual entrepreneur, and there are atoms of nature. Physical atoms are indestructible, that can bang into each other and separate and bounce off, but are not themselves changed by the experience. So as we examine the thinking behind the development of science, we think that it's very, very often influenced by the self-evident understanding of the kind of world that they were in, the kind of problems that they were confronting. This meant that there are issues that they don't deal with, and paradoxes that can be debilitating. I would like to deal with a few of the paradoxes that we are confronting. One of these is Audre Lorde and Rosa Luxemburg. Audre Lorde is famous for her statement, "You cannot tear down the master's house with the master's tools." Rosa Luxemburg said, we are trying to build anew with the materials of the old. And the materials of the old include ourselves. We'll consider this two propositions. We are each responsible for our own health. Health is determined socially and can only be fixed socially. Now look at those two propositions. If you assume the first, we are each responsible for our own health. If you're in a position to take care of your health, you can search on the web, you can educate yourself about particular diseases, you can join the foundation of sufferers of that disease. There are a lot of things that you can do to take care of yourself. You can improve your diet, and you can exercise. Therefore, the proposition you are responsible for your own health is liberating. It tells you don't depend on them. They are poisoning you, but you can fight back. But what if you can't? What if you do not have the resources, the literacy, the access? Then the proposition you are responsible for your own health is demoralizing. I'm stuck, there's nothing I can do about it. Well, that's life. You are getting on in years. There are all kinds of things which will tell you to accept the illnesses of our world, because you don't have control over it. That you would do something if you could. You might hop from doctor to doctor. But basically, if you don't have the means for applying that proposition, then you're simply demoralized and have to accept premature ailment and death. So let's consider health is determined socially by the ways in which we're loading the environment with poisons, by the way food is being produced, by the way housing is constructed to satisfy real estate needs, the way industry poisons its workers. So clearly, society is responsible for the health of our populations, for the reasons why life expectancy can be in the 80s in the advanced capitalist countries, and in the 40s in the poorer countries of Africa. All right, so now if we assume that society is responsible for our health, and we are able to organize, we are able to expose the lying of the patent industries, if we're able to challenge what they're dumping in our rivers, then the proposition society is responsible for our health is liberating. It's a clarion call to enter into battle. What if you can't? What if you're in a place where you do not have the resources, where you can't talk to other people about health, where they take a fatalistic view? Then the proposition your health is determined by society becomes demoralizing. So my conclusion then is that if we look at these two propositions, they are separately false, but jointly true. Jointly, they are telling us we can get together to make a healthier world, and also that we can tap into the existing knowledge to protect our own personal health. Now, the same kind of argument comes back to the Rosa Luxemburg Audre Lorde distinction. What Audre Lorde was saying is that do not accept the norms, the means, the tools of the existing oppressive society. Do not think you're going to solve hunger by spreading more pesticides. Do not think you're going to be better by trusting the medicines coming out of the corporations. Do not think that a good diet comes from the feedlots. You have to do something different. You have to challenge the way society is organized. Rosa Luxemburg is telling us we who are trying to change the world are also a product of that world. We are going to confront, even within our own movements, people who risk their lives in revolutionary struggle and yet rip off the union's treasury. People who are veterans of a revolutionary armed struggle but play the black market. South African heroes who say, I didn't risk my life for 20 years in order to be poor. So Rosa is warning us, when we overthrow the prevailing system of oppression, that's only the starting point. That we have to be changing ourselves at the same time that we change the world. So once again, we have a pair of propositions that are separately false and jointly true. And that is the structure of the world in a lot of different ways. The same medication, like Ritalin, is used to calm down children, but to energize adults. The same medication can be curative, but can also make you sicker. So we have a world which is chock full of paradoxes of this sort. In my own work as an ecologist, I ask my students, is the abundance of an animal determined by its food supply or by its predators? And the student will answer, it's clearly determined by the food supply, because the more food available, the higher the reproductive rate of the animals and the greater the population. Another student is waving her hand and saying, no. What's happening is that there's plenty of food around for animals, but the predators will be eating them. And the more predators there are, the fewer survivors there will be. And animals have gone extinct because they were overwhelmed by their predators. Now, when two arguments are equally plausible, this means that we've not posed the question correctly. And therefore, we have to go back and re-examine the question. The question is not, do predators determine prey, or do prey determine predators, but rather, what is the relationship between them? If the system varies because of things that affect the food supply of the prey, then the more prey produces more predators. The two will rise and fall together. But if it's the weather that's too hot for the laying of eggs by the predator, then things that make life worse for the predator make it better for the prey. Things that make it better for the predator make it worse for the prey. So they move in opposite directions. And if you look at them statistically, sometimes they'll be correlated positively and sometimes negatively. The question has been posed incorrectly. There's been increasing interest in recent years in human evolution. For one thing, we're finding new species that seem to have been closely related to us that are neither Neanderthals nor humans. The Denisovas found in Eurasia, the Homo floresiensis on an island in Indonesia, the so-called hobbit. We're finding evidence that related species to our own, who are different, nevertheless made tools. The tools were rather primitive tools. And it's interesting, when we talk about efficiency, every kind of relationship, every kind of society or species gives its own meaning to efficiency. For Stone Age people, we can understand their productivity by asking how much of a cutting edge, how many meters of a cutting edge can you get per 100 pounds of rock? And this might be on the order of a tenth of a meter in Homo erectus, and maybe a fraction of a meter in Neanderthals, and you begin to get 10 and 20 meters of cutting edge when it's people who are chipping away at the stones. So efficiency, which seems like a self-evident term, has very different meaning depending on who you are. So in the Pleistocene, it had the meaning of how much stone grinding you can do. In the Bible, it's how many seeds do you harvest for each seed planted. Your crops shall be returned manyfold. In Europe, that very quickly became land shortage. Yield was quintals or tons per hectare. In North America, where there was plenty of land but a shortage of labor that could be exploited, it was bushels per labor day invested. Nowadays, ecologists are asking the question, how much energy do you harvest per unit of energy invested in fuel, in pesticides, in chemicals? So even self-evident terms are culture-bound, and you always ask the question, how is this dependent on its context? Another way of asking is, where does the rest of the world fit in? In the discussions about human evolution, a recent book is Why Nations Fail, by Acemoglu and Robinson. And they are arguing essentially that it's the social institutions of a society which determine its survival or its extinction. Jared Diamond wrote a very antagonistic review of that book in the New York Review of Books recently, because Jared is a proponent of the geographic ecological explanation. Now, when Jared's book came out, what he was arguing is there are very few animals that could be domesticated in the Americas. There's the llama and the turkey, and pretty much nothing else, dogs maybe. Whereas you had domestication of animals, goats, sheep, cattle, horses, camels, in the Near East and Egypt, North Africa. So he says that it's the geography of places, the numbers of species of plants and animals that can be domesticated, the ease of transport that determine which societies have been successful and which of them disappeared. So that's the nature of the argument as it's being debated. And once again, we can start thinking about this, and we say that it's certainly true. The Australian Aborigines were never able to develop agriculture because there was nothing to develop. There were no plants that they could domesticate. Well, the domestication of plants and animals took place more or less at the same time throughout the world where it happened. Now, a couple of thousand years, give and take, doesn't matter on the scale of a few 100,000 years of our species, but it's quite striking that you had about 8 centers of domestication that developed around the same time in the Middle East, China, India, Central America, North America, East Africa, New Guinea. And they all domesticated plants, some of them also animals. And some of those civilizations survived and others did not. Well, in some cases they were destroyed militarily. In other cases there were climate change, the drying out, because even though we're a young species, we've been around long enough for there to be periods of drought, very long periods of drought. There was a 500-year drought in Bolivia at one time historically that caused the abandonment for a time of the canals that they used, not for irrigation, but to modulate the nighttime temperature. Because water picks up heat during the day and releases it at night, and therefore their potatoes didn't freeze. But it takes an awful lot of work to dig those canals, and a 500-year drought was just too much for them. When we attempted to interpret why did the Anasazi, the ancestors of the present-day Navajo and Hopi, disappear, explanations are offered of a long-term drought, and we do know that the Southwest has been subject to drought at many times. Why did the Norwegian settlers of Greenland disappear? Well, here's a problem. When the climate starts getting cold, the first thing you feel is the growing season getting shorter. They couldn't grow wheat anymore. There wasn't enough time to get a crop of wheat. So they switched over to barley. And with the barley, they could extend the growing season longer. Got it colder again, couldn't grow crops at all, but they could still pasture sheep. After a while, it was getting too tough for sheep. They couldn't really do any trade with Norway because the North Sea was full of ice. Those who survived went back to Norway and the rest died out in Greenland. While waiting for them a few hundred miles north, the Inuit had a thriving economy based on sea life. There was contact between the Inuit and the Norwegians, but the Norwegian rulers wouldn't allow that. They did not want to pick up, the ideology was that they were not going to be following those people who were inferior. The practical problem is that it's hard to control fisher folk. They go off in their boats and have these big long knives. So it's difficult. So when we come back to the question then, was it society or was it nature? We see that it's a false question. The question is, how does society respond to the changes in nature, to the demands of nature? How does the physical geography give rise to the way people make a living and the way they relate to each other? For instance, in Eurasia, the world occurs in patches. Well, it always occurs in environmental patches. In Asia, in northern Asia, Eurasia, these patches were pretty big. Hundreds of miles of savanna land, grass, and so on. There'd be small areas of oases where you could plant things. So what happened is that in Asia, in Eurasia, there were agricultural peoples and there were nomadic pastoralists, but they weren't the same folks. When you move further west in Asia, come to the region of Palestine, Lebanon, and so forth, the physical geography is such that you have small valleys and low hills. The Judean hills aren't these snow-capped mountains. You can walk across the valley in an afternoon. So what happened was that the ancient peoples of the Middle East had a mixed economy of growing crops and herding animals. And these are the people who you see figured in the Bible. Abraham and his cousin Lot worrying about water and pasturage for their herds. So we have to answer this question in general terms by saying that there's an intimate interaction between society and nature, with society, first of all, arising out of natural conditions, but secondly, determining how people relate to nature, how they respond to the changing conditions of nature. So now I want to ask the question, what kind of vor are we? Now we know we divide up the animals into herbivores, carnivores, a few omnivores, or you can do it more finely and talk about insectivores and detritivores. There are leaf eaters, foliivores, and seed eaters. So what kind of vor are we? Well, in one sense, we're omnivores. Did you have a question?
I was just trying to...
Oh, okay. So where do we fit in among all of these different kinds of vores? If you're looking at the digestive enzymes in the mouth, we're omnivores. We eat a lot of vegetable matter. We have an alkaline mouth, whereas carnivores have acid mouths. They're more adapted to the digestion of protein. We have teeth that can grind vegetation, but also teeth that can tear meat. Our dentition tells us something about the diet. Okay, and even though there aren't very many omnivores among the higher mammals, we're among them. Bears are notorious omnivores. Even though they belong to the group that's called carnivores, bears will eat vegetable matter. Notoriously, they'll invade beehives, and they will also attack mammals. Whales are omnivores because they feed on plankton, and they really can't tell apart whether something is an alga or a crustacean. They just slurp it all in and spit out what they don't like. So in a certain sense then, emphasizing our continuity with the rest of nature, we're omnivores. Except that we don't only gather our food, we produce it. And so I've introduced the notion of the productivore mode of adaptation. Productivores produce their own food by processes that turn the inedible into edible. And here the domestication of fire is the crucial step. Once you cook, you can eat things that you couldn't eat before. And furthermore, you can digest it pretty quickly, so you don't have to spend the whole day chewing. So the domestication of fire was an important step in our becoming productivores. We could use animal material for other purposes, get an extra skin, furs for keeping warm, which allowed Neanderthals to expand into Northern Europe and Eurasia. In a way, cooking is carrying out some of our digestion outside the body. Very few other animals can do this. Rattlesnakes can. But the rattlesnakes do it by injecting a venom, which is a digestive enzyme. And so, while their poison is circulating through their prey and killing them, they're also digesting the prey. Because reptiles otherwise have a very slow digestive process. It's kind of cold inside a snake, so that things happen more slowly. And it's only the larger reptiles that are able to handle vegetable matter. The Brontosaurus was big enough to do this. The temperature in the belly of a Brontosaurus was probably warm enough to speed up fermentation. Because when a reptile is digesting, it's kind of inactive, and that makes it vulnerable to its enemies. So the answer to our question then has to be that we are neither carnivores nor herbivores nor omnivores, but productivores. And from the point of view of understanding the way we relate to the rest of nature then, we are producing our own food, and that allows us to use a very wide range of materials that we couldn't use before. We can digest it outside the bodies, we can store it, and again, storing a food outside the body is not quite unique to people. Certainly ants do it when they gather seeds or when they grow fungi. Spiders will store their prey in the web. There are bees which capture insects and put them in little cells in the mud embankment and then lay their eggs there. Honeybees transform their food. So there'll be odd examples, just enough to suggest that we're not totally unique in what we do. We can store food. And one way of storing it is drying it. Another way is salting. Now that we have fire, we can smoke the food. And in a dry climate, the Hopi Indians were able to store corn for about 3 years. And this served then to balance out the fluctuations in rainfall and to maintain then a more or less stable kind of diet. We can store food in jars, but this requires making jars. So with the Neolithic Revolution and the beginning of ceramics and the Mesolithic, really, we can now harvest and store. And the jar becomes a measure of somebody's wealth. In class societies, people store their harvest in jars until they use it up. Then they have to buy grain on the market at a much higher price. If they don't have enough jars, they're selling their harvest when it's cheap and then buying it back when it's expensive. But the storing of things in jars is one of the ways of keeping stock. There are stories in the Bible which indicate that the storing of grain was an important activity, particularly the legend of Gideon. In Gideon's army, in Gideon's time, they would harvest the grain and store it in jars, but then the Midianites would come and rip off the grain. So people would bury the jars up in the hills when there was Midianite season, and then come down and continue with their village life. Storing in jars, one earlier step in storage of food is storing it in the body as fat. This makes it good. So a greeting in Puerto Rico is "Estás gordo." You've put on weight, that's a good sign. It means that you're prosperous.
It's change.
What's that?
This came 7 months from over there, it's change. Actually, we recognize that we're overweight.
That's right.
And actually, we are among the first 3 more overweight people in the hemisphere.
Yes.
And we recognize that.
We recognize that the storing of fat is pathological the way it's developed in our societies, but was one of the adaptations to the uneven food supply in the past. Trouble with storing food in the body is, first of all, it may you have more weight to carry around. And secondly, it's an insulation. So in hot weather, you suffer more. So there are limits to this method of storing food. The next method is the jar, storing it outside the body. There are 2 limitations on that. One, it can get moldy and infected by insects. In fact, there are moths which are adapted to living in warehouses, the grain moths. So there are limits to what you can store.